after the event. You'll receive an email notification in about a week letting you know when everything is available. You'll also notice our presenters' contact information as well as mine. Please feel free to contact us directly with any questions that haven't been answered in the follow-up resources. We're also using Twitter today with the hashtag DemcoIdeas. You should be able to see this hashtag on the side of your screen in the chat box. We are monitoring that feed as well for questions and comments. You'll also see the slides from today's presentation as well as a PDF of an infographic in the section labeled Handouts. These are available for download at any time during the presentation. I believe that's all the housekeeping, so let's get started with the program. As I mentioned, I'm Liz Bowie, Content Manager at Demco, and I'm moderating today's session. I'm very excited to introduce you to our speaker today, Laura Fleming. Laura is a library media specialist at New Milford High School in New Jersey. She has been an educator in New Jersey for 20 years, where she's been both a classroom teacher and media specialist in grades K through 12. Her library's Makerspace has garnered national attention and has served as an inspiration for schools across the country. Laura co-hosts the Movers and Makers podcast and is the author of the best-selling book, Worlds of Learning, Best Practices for Establishing a Makerspace for Your School. She is also the creator of a digital badge-based professional development platform in which educators all over the world earn badges in acknowledgement of their professional learning. Laura is also a recipient of the National School Board's 20 to Watch in Educational Technology Leadership for 2014 and was recently nominated as a White House Champion of Change for Making. Among her many other projects, she has recently launched the Worlds of Making Digital Academy, of which Demco is a proud sponsor. The Digital Academy provides cost-effective makerspace professional development for educators. So whatever stage of planning you're currently in with your makerspace, our hope is that by the end of the session, you'll walk away with new ideas for the types of tools you can add to your makerspace. And we're ready to begin today's session. So Laura, you can get started whenever you're ready.
Hi everyone. I am super honored to be here with all of you today. A huge thanks to Demco for making this happen. I am really genuinely excited about today's topic because it isn't one that I usually talk about. In fact, I never talk about. In my work with schools across the country, I have always shied away from telling people what they should buy in their makerspace. But today we're going to discuss a process for how you can go about selecting the right products for your makerspace. And I'm going to give you some examples of some products that I like. This information will apply to you, I hope, whether you're a school librarian at any grade level, a public librarian, a librarian in the higher ed space, or anyone else who might have joined. I receive inquiries from educators across the country, really across the world, regarding makerspaces. Many of those inquiries include questions similar to those that you see on this slide. Maybe even some of you here today have similar questions. They're pretty common. More often than not, the inquiries I receive from educators almost always focus on the stuff. They tell me how much money they have, and they want to know from me what they should buy. I think many are frustrated with my reply, to be honest, because I never tell them what to buy. I do emphasize, though, the importance of proper planning and uncovering what works best for your school community or library. And this is what we're going to dive into today. So hopefully, if you're someone with one of these questions or questions that are similar, you'll have those questions answered today. We live in a participatory society where content and opportunities to create and participate in all we do surround us 24/7. Even watching a TV show, for example, is no longer a passive act. We're encouraged to vote or participate by tweeting along as we watch. And while the idea of a participatory culture isn't necessarily anything new, it definitely has become that much more pervasive and relevant as a result of new technologies. So what relevance does this societal trend of a participatory culture have for our libraries? My philosophy of libraries is basically that they should reflect that element of a participatory culture that we see in the world, and therefore be as participatory as possible. This idea of having a participatory culture has run through everything I have ever done in my libraries and still drives everything that I do. I strive to provide as many opportunities as possible for my students to do things, to become not just consumers of information and content, but creators as well. I want them to be able to turn their knowledge into action. I believe that it is up to us as librarians not only to provide our patrons or students with access to information and content, but it is up to us to provide them also with the tools, materials, supplies, and resources they need to become creators as well. As I said, my philosophy of having a participatory culture runs through all that I do in my library. We recently kicked this up another notch in my library by building a stage in which our students now can give speeches on, TED Talks, plays, skits. They sing, they dance, they play instruments, and so on. It is my belief that every child has the right to invent, tinker, create, innovate, make, and do. Do maker spaces have to be in libraries? No, absolutely not. But what better place to ensure that equity and to democratize the resources children and adults need in order to be able to invent, tinker, create, innovate, make, and do than in a library? For those of you who don't know my story, I will briefly tell you. A few years back, I was recruited by my then principal, Eric Scheninger, to be the library media specialist at New Milford High School, where I am now. Basically, I was brought into his school to breathe life into his unused library. The photo on the left-hand side of this slide was a photo that I took on my first day of school at New Milford High School. And that photo doesn't really look like it's anything special. It kind of looks like a lot of libraries that we see. But what was so astounding to me about what this photo, I took this photograph right in the middle of the school day. For that entire first day, and really for probably my entire first few days, literally not one person came into the library. Not one student, not one teacher. It was described by my principal, Eric, as a barren wasteland. So my challenge was to transform it into a vibrant learning environment that our students needed, deserved, and valued. So I decided to draw upon my prior making experiences as well as that philosophy of having a participatory culture. And I decided to create a makerspace in my library at New Milford High School. And I'm so happy to say that in an incredibly short amount of time, really within a matter of weeks, thanks to our makerspace, our once barren library was turned into a thriving learning metropolis. Again, Eric's words. And you can see the transformation in the photos on the right-hand side of this slide. Our library was literally transformed, thanks to our makerspace, into a standing room only environment. Before we go any further, we need to take a minute to define what a makerspace actually is. Depending on who you talk to or what you read, you will see varying definitions of what a makerspace is. Maybe you even have your own. None of them are incorrect. That is part of the beauty of the maker movement, really, and of maker spaces. It's deeply personal to those who are involved. I wanted to share with you, though, my definition of what a makerspace is, because it really is this definition that drives every choice and decision I make for my makerspace, including selecting the right products for my makerspace. So I define a makerspace as a unique learning environment that encourages tinkering, play, and open-ended exploration for all. While the idea of making is definitely not something new, today's makerspaces are rooted firmly in the 21st century. They're a mashup of differentiated learning experiences combining traditional elements and supported by new technologies. Many people associate the maker movement with the stuff, things like 3D printers. But in my opinion, this is not what pushes children outside of their comfort zone. It really is that opportunity for open-ended exploration that's key. When creating a makerspace, many school districts and libraries just go out and buy things that other districts and libraries buy. But really, in essence, just replicating another school district's or library's makerspace. In my opinion, no two school makerspaces, no two library makerspaces should be exactly alike, because no two school communities or libraries are exactly alike. Simon Sinek, maybe you've heard of him. He is the author of the best-selling book, Start With Why. If you haven't read it, I definitely recommend it. In this book, he talks about the importance of knowing your why, the purpose, cause, or belief that drives and inspires you to do what you do. So why do you want a makerspace? Why do you have one? It is so important to ask yourself these questions. Do you have or want a makerspace because it's a trend or a buzzword you've heard? Are you interested in them just because other people are and you feel like you should be too? There needs to be more to it than that. These are questions that I ask you to reflect on today. In my opinion, every makerspace needs to have their own unique vision. That vision should be written of a maker mission statement or a vision statement. That statement will help you convey to others what your makerspace is trying to achieve and help people better understand your space, both kids and adults. But it will also help you be able to better select products that are appropriate and meaningful to your particular makerspace. You cannot possibly determine the right products for your makerspace if you don't know what it is you are trying to do. In addition to developing or crafting a vision or mission statement, I cannot stress enough the importance of properly planning your makerspace. It really is this process that is going to help you uncover a space that is unique, meaningful, and relevant to your school community or library. It's also this process that is going to help you ensure that your space is vibrant and successful, not just for now, but also sustainable into the future, which is something many people don't consider. While many people associate the maker movement with STEM-related concepts, they do not have to be limited to just those. This process will help you uncover themes that are relevant to your school community or your library. Many people take a resource-driven approach when planning a makerspace. They make it all about the stuff. The process that I use is different than that. I use a thematic approach. This process makes connections first and foremost to your learners. It also connects to your school community, your library, standards and curricula, and it also connects to global trends and best practices, ensuring that your space is unique and relevant. Here are examples of themes that I have had in my makerspace. Now you'll see that our themes are very STEM heavy, but this is what works best for our school and not necessarily what works best for others. The idea behind a themed approach is that it offers a personalized approach for planning your makerspace. Having themes streamlines the ordering process. They give you a much more targeted lens than you might otherwise have had before. Themes provide opportunities for your students to take their learning deeper. Themes will help you ensure that you have available not just one or two things related to these themes, but a suite of multimodal materials to differentiate and to be able to meet the varying learning styles of the students who will be visiting your space. It is critical to understand when using a thematic approach to planning your makerspace what themes are and what they are not. A theme is meant to be seen as a launch pad to kickstart making and creativity. They're meant to inspire students and to spark ideas. And they're helpful for those children or those makers who might have trouble working with zero guidelines. Themes are definitely not rules, restrictions, or a ceiling. Give me 1 second. Technical difficulties. After you follow that makerspace planning process that I showed you earlier, the final phase is to discover how you can best support those themes that you've uncovered with resources, materials, and supplies and equipment. Notice I said support. This phase of the planning process doesn't necessarily even mean that you have to purchase anything. Supporting your themes is possible to do on any budget. Sometimes your best supplies and resources are right there in your library, or right there in your school community, or even the town that your makerspace is in. Sometimes they come from a dollar store, and other times, if your budget allows, it might be more expensive or big ticket items. It is possible to support the themes of a makerspace on any budget. It's all about making the most of what you have available to you and not making excuses. So once you have your themes in place, and if you have a budget or access to materials, resources, and supplies, it can be pretty overwhelming. So how do you decide what to select for your makerspace? This is the Worlds of Making framework for choosing the right products for your makerspace. This is the framework I use to decide what I want to put in my makerspace. And it is the one that I have used for years, and it has never let me down. I'm really excited to share it with you all today for the very first time. In my opinion, Next generation makerspaces are mobile. So the first section of my framework is about mobility. Does the product support free-range learning and liberate learners and children and makers from the limitation of a physical makerspace, therefore increasing equity and access? Just as students no longer need to be tied to a computer lab, mobile technologies can liberate learners from the limitations of a physical makerspace so that you can build an environment that includes resources that encourage tinkering, play, and open-ended exploration for everyone. Equity and access are at the heart of ensuring that all students, children, and makers have the opportunities available to them that makerspaces present. The next section of my framework echoes a piece of my definition of a makerspace, the importance of that open-ended exploration. Many people tend to go out when stocking their makerspace and buy kit after kit to fill their makerspace with. Many kits that are available are limiting in that students have no options other than following step-by-step directions to make something. Our students have opportunities to follow directions and make things all of the time by following step-by-step directions, both in school and at home. But what differentiates a makerspace experience from those is the opportunity for students to take control of their own learning. It's a student-driven learning environment. So when choosing products for your makerspace, you need to ask yourself, is the product limited to step-by-step directions, or does it maximize inquiry by allowing the opportunity for open-ended exploration? During the makerspace planning process that I showed you earlier, I talked about how first and foremost that process begins with understanding your learners. In my opinion, without the voice of children, your makerspace is nothing more than a bunch of stuff in a room. So often I get asked the question, what should I buy that would get my students excited? Or how do I know what to buy that my students would be interested in? My response is always, ask them. Take the time with your learners to hear their voice, to give them a voice, and to connect your space and the products in it to the needs, wants, and interests of your students, children, and makers. The next step in the framework for selecting the right products for your makerspace is empowerment and engagement. In my makerspace, I have what are called fixed stations and flexible stations. The fixed stations are products, materials, supplies, activities that are out in my makerspace at all times. The flexible stations are activities, resources, products, materials, supplies that rotate in and out of our space. Oftentimes, these flexible stations need extra support, guidance, or modeling. However, the materials and resources, supplies, and products that are at the fixed stations, the ones that are out in the space at all times, have a low barrier of entry. A low barrier of entry is a critical component of any participatory culture. This means that the products that are in those fixed stations are easy enough for the students to get started with independently, maybe with the help of signage or prompts or modeling of some kind. But overall, they meet the students, they meet the children, they meet the makers where they are, building on their own unique level of prior knowledge. This ensures that our makerspaces are inclusive, that they meet the needs of all of our learners and help to build learner independence. There are huge differences between rigor and difficulty. It is possible that our students will still be challenged with these products that have a low barrier of entry. I look for products that have a low barrier of entry, yes, but also ones in which the sky is the limit, ones that allow my students to ultimately take their learning as deep as they would like. When I was discussing that makerspace planning process, I spoke about the importance of connecting your makerspace to your school community as well as the wider world. When looking for products for my makerspace, I want to be sure that they have relevant connections or that they allow for relevant connections to be made to my school community, my library, and the wider world. This relevance is what will ensure that what your students, children, or makers learn in your makerspace will resonate with them beyond just the time spent in your makerspace. It will bring authenticity into your makerspace and give it context and meaning. So just to recap the World of Making framework for choosing the right products for your makerspace, we talked about the criteria for selecting products for your makerspace. These included mobility, which includes equity and access, allowing for open-ended exploration, knowledge of students' needs, wants, and interests, empowerment and engagement, and finally, and certainly not last, not least, is relevance. So this is the framework I use for choosing products for my makerspace. It is one that will ensure that you select products that complement the vision of your unique makerspace. Something I want to add too is don't be afraid to step outside of your comfort zone when selecting products for your makerspace. You certainly don't at the things you select. I've chosen many things for my makerspace that I don't know how to do myself. This is an opportunity to let your students take the lead, to seek out other experts, to invite them into your space, and to learn right alongside your students or your children or your makers. If you do have a budget and you are going to spend money on products, this framework will ensure that you get the most bang for your buck. I wanted to take a few minutes to show you an example of a company who creates products that align directly with all of the criteria in that framework. The company is called Teacher Geek. Demco's line of Teacher Geek products offer bulk components for making inventions. Something I love about them is that these components are transdisciplinary, meaning that they can be used in your makerspace to make connections across the curriculum. Their products cultivate and foster creativity and innovation, but they do not dictate how or what the students should make. While I don't support Makerspace in a box types of packages, Teacher Geek offers a maker cart that I have to say I absolutely love. All of the materials in this Makerspace cart fit all of the criteria of my framework and essentially gives students the components they need in order to be able to invent, tinker, create, make, and do just about anything. Each cart also includes replacement supplies, giving your students almost 15,000 components in total and tools to create almost any project they choose. And the sign is also dry erase, allowing you to customize it for your makerspace. I should mention too that Teacher Geek has a fabulous website that includes free documents, videos, and downloads to support not only this cart and everything in it, but all of the products that they have available. Definitely check them out. In addition to the Teacher Geek products, check out my blog post, which is titled Top 10 Makerspace Favorites of 2015. This blog post was written by myself and my colleague Travis Lape, who's an educator in South Dakota. This blog post includes a list of products that fit the criteria in the framework I presented to you today. And also stay tuned for our favorites of 2016, which will be released before the new year. So we kicked off our webinar today by talking about a participatory culture. Well, in an effort to make our webinar even more participatory, I started this Padlet on selecting products for your makerspace. It includes contributions already from my PLN, of which you can read, but I also encourage all of you to add your thoughts and insight based on your experiences in selecting products for your makerspace. We can all certainly learn and grow from each other. You'll see the link to the Padlet on this slide, and you'll also be receiving a copy of these slides so that you can go directly to the Padlet yourself. So just a quick review of what we discussed today that hopefully will help you select the right products for your makerspace. It's very important that you take the time to uncover your own unique why and take the time to write it down. Actually craft a vision or a mission statement. And I have more on my blog for how you should go about doing that if you want some tips. Definitely check that out. We also talked about the importance of properly planning your makerspace. Remember, start with the voice of the make connections to your school community, connections to standards and curricula, make connections to global trends and best practices. Finally, after creating themes, you're going to support those themes by selecting the appropriate tools, materials, supplies, and resources using the criteria I laid out for you today in the world of making framework to help guide your choices. Okay, thank you everybody. We have time for questions. I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone might have.
Thanks so much, Laura. Looks like we do have time for a couple questions. And just a reminder that the full Q&A will be emailed to you next week if we don't get to your question today. Laura, the first question we have for you is how do I get the students and staff excited about the Makerspace?
My advice is always to get them involved as possible from the get-go. So that first phase of the planning process where you're giving your students a voice, I have worked with schools who have even had students on Makerspace planning committees. So the more you can involve them from the start, the more invested they're going to be in the space and the more excited they're going to be in the space. And the same is true for teachers as well. I think the most successful makerspaces that I have seen are makerspaces that have been planned, created, and rolled out as a group. So that means just, one person isn't necessarily responsible for all of that, but a team of people has been put together that plans and creates and rolls out these spaces together. So again, that might include students, that might include the librarian, that might include classroom teachers. I've worked with schools who have also included administrators, which is always a fantastic thing, or other stakeholders, members of the Board of Education or educational foundations that might be funding aspects of the makerspace. The more people that are involved in the planning and creation and rolling out of the makerspace, the more invested they're going to feel in the space and the more excited they're ultimately going to be.
Thanks, Laura. We have a few questions about scheduling for makerspaces. A couple of the questions were, is it feasible to do a library makerspace during a 15-minute recess? Another person asks, are your classes scheduled? Are your makerspace classes scheduled to come in, or do kids come in individually? So maybe if you could just talk about some of the different scheduling aspects.
Sure, absolutely. That's a question I get asked very frequently. And something I tried to emphasize in today's webinar, and something I try to emphasize in all of the work that I do with schools, in creating makerspaces, is that there is not one right way to do any of this. It's all about doing it in a way that works for you. So my makerspace, for example, is an informal learning environment. I don't have a fixed schedule, so no one tells the students that they have to visit the makerspace or the library. No one tells them when they have to visit, if they have to visit at all, and certainly no one tells them what they have to do when they get there. So for me, it's all very informal and relaxed. I tend to get a lot of our students visiting during the lunchtime hours. We allow food and drink in our library in order to best leverage those lunchtime periods. But for other schools, that model simply doesn't work. I used to work in an elementary school library where I had a fixed schedule and I had classes back to back to back to back, so I understand those constraints as well. In that situation, for me, we had pop-up makerspaces in which I pulled out materials and supplies and products for them to be able to tinker with during the last half of class. There were times where I integrated those things into the projects and activities we were doing, or the units or the author studies we were doing, and so we used those things during class time. It varied, but again, it's about doing it in a way that works best for you. I've worked with schools who have formed clubs. I've worked with schools who have alternating library schedules. One week is regular library class, the next week is makerspace in the library, is the time for makerspaces in the library. I've worked with schools who have had makerspaces in their hallways, who've had makerspaces in their cafeterias. There really isn't one right way to do it. So I want everyone to feel empowered and comfortable with doing these things in a way that works best for you, your students, and your school community.
Thanks, Laura. We have a question about connecting to different areas of the school. So, for instance, home economics, health, science. Do you make those connections all in the one same space, or do you kind of have separate areas that make those connections?
Well, again, there isn't one right way to do any of this, so yes, it's absolutely possible to make those connections if those connections are connections that are relevant to your school community. In the case of my school, those connections were definitely relevant. So if we go back to that makerspace planning process, one of the phases, the second phase in that planning process, allows you to be able to make those connections across the curriculum. And those connections, building in those connections, forming themes around those connections, led not only to some amazing experiences within my Makerspace, but also led to some amazing collaborations with those teachers. Those teachers, and it all happened very organically, in fact. Those teachers started to see that we were making connections to what they were doing in our Makerspace, and they started to approach me and say, hey, I see that you're doing such and such down in your Makerspace. Could we perhaps collaborate and do some of that in my classroom and with my students? So those connections have led to some amazing collaborations. So yes, it's absolutely possible. And in fact, if we follow that planning process, that second phase of the planning process shows that it's critical to make those connections when planning a makerspace.
Okay, we have a few questions about keeping the space clean and types of storage that you use for all the little parts. How do you keep track of all the little parts, and how do you handle having students working on so many different things in the space at one time?
Yeah, I know this is something that's different for everyone depending on what kind of library you have or what kind of makerspace, what kind of room you're in. My library prior to this school year hadn't been renovated in probably about 50 years. So nothing was off limits. We were able to hack, modify, make a mess, do whatever we wanted, and it really suited what we did very well. Well, over the summer, my library was renovated, so now we have this new beautiful space, and we certainly are much more careful in this space than we were in our previous space. However, we created a makerspace that's conducive to making. So we chose flooring that is very durable. It's different flooring than in the rest of the library. We created a space that we knew would get a little messy, and frankly, the messier the makerspace, the more used it is. I get sort of concerned when I walk into maker spaces and they're perfectly organized and perfectly cleaned. The messiness indicates that something great has been happening in that space. So we're okay with the mess. I always attribute the storage of materials to a Please Touch museum. So if you've ever visited a Please Touch museum with your child or with a class on a class trip, you know that when you walk into those museums, the children never have to ask for permission to touch things in those museums. It's the way the materials are presented to the kids. It's the way that they're stored that makes the kids know and understand this is a kid space. This is a kid-friendly space. So I always tell people your maker spaces should look a lot like a Please Touch museum. You never want your students to feel like they have to ask for permission to touch something because it's organized so perfectly and nicely and neatly. We definitely store things in kid-friendly ways. And again, instead of guessing what those ways are, I ask the kids. I say, hey, listen, here are our little bits. How could we store these? How should we store these in a way in which you would be apt to sit down and use them? And I tell you what, we tried a few different things over the course of time, and I definitely notice a difference with how materials are stored as far as drawing students in and having them feel comfortable. So definitely think about a Please Touch museum. Definitely ask your students, and definitely step outside of your comfort zone a bit. I know a lot of librarians are very organized, and that's a fantastic trait for a librarian to have. But in creating these spaces, that isn't necessarily the best trait. We want materials and supplies to be stored in a kid-friendly way.
Thanks, Laura. This one might be kind of difficult for you. Somebody wants to know what your favorite Makerspace tool or resource is.
Yeah, that one, Liz, you know me well. Yeah, I definitely don't have a favorite. As I said in this webinar, I absolutely love the line of Teacher Geek products because they align to all of those criteria in that framework that I presented. But truly, my favorite Makerspace items are the ones that reach and engage kids the most. And for us, that varies on a daily basis, a weekly basis, a monthly basis. depending on the students that are coming into the makerspace, it's interesting to see what kinds of materials appeal most to them. And I have to tell you, a lot of the times, they're the things that I wouldn't predict would connect with them the most. So, you know, in purchasing materials and supplies, that's definitely a lesson that I've learned over time. I'll never forget one time I bought a sewing kit where you can actually sew circuits, and I thought, ooh, this will be a great activity to get the girls into the makerspace. They'll really like this, the connection to sewing. Well, we had a session during one of the lunchtime periods on this, and I was surrounded by, you know, 25 boys who were there to learn how to sew. So it was definitely something that I couldn't predict. So my favorite products are the ones that connect with our students the most, and that varies on a daily basis.
Laura, do you have any thoughts about, and this, I think these questions are from both public and school librarians, how do they balance having the quiet library space next to a noisy, more collaborative makerspace?
My experience has been that 21st century libraries are not as quiet as libraries once were. With that being said, I definitely am aware that there are times in which students need, or faculty need and want, quiet spaces. So it is a balancing act for sure. I definitely can say that our library has a quieter is a quieter space throughout most of the school day, except for the lunchtime periods. The lunchtime periods are definitely when we get a lot of our traffic. During the lunchtime periods, it definitely is still possible to sit and get work done. I kind of compare it to a Starbucks type of environment. It's that white noise that for the most part we hear. But we do have quiet spaces throughout the library. We do have little rooms off of our main space in which students can close the door and they can get extra quiet if that's what they need. There have been times where I've even given up my office. That happens all the time where students use my office. So we're really flexible. We try to be very accommodating to all of our students. But for the most part, I have to say that during the lunchtime periods, most of our students are not looking for a quiet space. They're looking for that release. They're looking to talk to their friends, to be with their peers, to work on projects and do activities and have some fun and, frankly, play. At the high school level, our students even still love to play, which is something that I love to see. And when their lunch is over, they seem more relaxed, they're smiling, and they head off to their afternoon classes, I hope in a better state of mind than when they entered into the library at the beginning of the lunch period. So it definitely is a balancing act, but it's something that we make work in our library for sure.
We have a few questions here about safety guidelines and maybe how do you train the students to use tools that require some more training or might need some safety guidelines.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what you have in your makerspace. You know, I've worked with schools who have had makerspaces that have been planned and created around things like health and wellness. Those aren't necessarily dangerous spaces. So it really depends on the themes you have running through your makerspace. It definitely depends on the products and materials and supplies that you stock your makerspace with. It also of students that you have in your makerspace and what you have them have access to or allow them to have access to. Anything that is quote unquote a little bit more dangerous in our makerspace is definitely a part of those flexible stations that I talked about. Things that rotate in and out of our space as opposed to being out in our makerspace at all times. We certainly don't leave those materials out in our space at all times. So that might mean that during one of the lunchtime periods we might hold a special workshop that demonstrates on how to use one of those tools properly. And sometimes that means I'm demonstrating something. Sometimes that means one of our IT guys is demonstrating something. Sometimes that might mean another classroom teacher or even a student or someone who I've brought into the makerspace is demonstrating something. But we definitely don't believe in putting tools, materials, or supplies that are dangerous to the students out in the space without having that proper training and that supervision as well. And how that works, again, is different for every makerspace. It's about doing it in a way that works best for you. I've worked with schools who have had their students have to pass a certain type of skills assessment where they can demonstrate to the adult in the space that they can properly use that tool, and then they're able to use that tool moving forward. So it's about doing it in a way that works for you and completely dependent upon what kinds of things you have in your makerspace.
We have someone who's starting out, wants to start out and has kind of a low budget and is looking for some low budget ideas just to get started for specific fixed stations. So if you have any ideas, thoughts on just some ways to get started with some specific stations.
Yeah, well, I definitely can't recommend specific stations without knowing the themes of the makerspace. If whoever that is wants to send me the themes, I'll be happy to brainstorm ideas with you. But my advice for anybody who's on a low budget is to, because I've been there before, I've been in spots where I've had a significant budget, and then I've been in spots when I've had a low budget or no budget. And I have to say that it was probably during those moments in which we had a low budget or no budget that we became the most creative. When I first launched our makerspace, I too went out and bought the kits and thought that that's what I had to do. And then boom, I didn't have a budget, so we couldn't go out and buy those kits. So what did we do? We started repurposing things that we had already, either in our library, our makerspace, or in our school community. One of our most vibrant stations in our makerspace is our Take Apart Technology station, in which students take apart and sometimes even rebuild computers or other technological items. And that station didn't cost us anything. All of the technology that we put in that fixed station comes from our IT department. They're computers or other pieces of equipment that normally would have been discarded because they were outdated or running slowly. They give us those things now for us to take apart, repurpose, put back together, and that is definitely one of our most used stations, and it didn't cost us anything. Something as simple as putting something in your makerspace with a sign that says, what else can this be? Can you transform this into something else? That type of challenge, those type of challenges are fantastic because, again, they get students to think outside of the box, but they also don't have to cost anything.
Okay, it looks like we're getting close to time here. I just have a few very quick questions for you, and then we'll wrap up. Someone wants to know how many students you serve, and then also several people are looking for the URL for your blog, and we'll also list that in the resources in the follow-up, but if you just want to let everybody know right now so they can check it out.
Sure. Our student population is about 500 students, give or take a few, and my blog is worlds, with an S, WORLDS, learning.com. And I also have a site specifically for makers found at worldsofmaking.com.
Wonderful. Thank you, Laura, for sharing all your insights today. And we hope everyone was able to take away some newfound knowledge to support your own initiatives. Like I mentioned, a recording of the webcast will be available on Demco Ideas and Inspiration website by next week, and that's ideas.demco.com. So you can review the presentation, share it with your colleagues, and next week you'll also receive an email that will include the presentation slides and a resource list, and also a Q&A log that documents all the answers that Laura gave today. You'll also be receiving a survey at the end of the webinar to let us know how we did. So if you could take a few minutes to give us your feedback and thoughts, that would be wonderful. And we hope you'll join us for our upcoming webinar on November 17th, when library marketing expert Angela Hirsch will be discussing easy ways to ramp up your library's marketing efforts. and you can register at ideas.demco.com. Again, thank you for joining us today and have a wonderful afternoon.